Uh-oh. Here comes Mark. He's gonna put his hay up today. Well, folks, you're gonna be hearing a whole bunch of John Deere noise. Sorry about that. Anyhow, last summer we did some shop stories. One about an Alaska moose hunt that completely crapped the bed on us. And then me drawing the best elk tag, archery elk tag in New Mexico, and dying of the dysentery. And everybody liked those, so the crew said, we need to do more of those. Well, you kind of got to be in storytelling mode or it just doesn't work. So the whole summer here I've spent kind of thinking about this. A lot of road time, some fishing time, and we're driving back from Fort Peck a couple months ago, and there's a guy out in his yard, and you could see a big lightning storm coming, and he's out fiddling in his yard. And my wife grew up in this really sheltered childhood. I'm the opposite. And she said, can you believe he's out there? There's a storm coming. I'm like, yeah, I can't believe that. He must not have a 7-year-old around. Because that's what my dad did. He didn't go out there in the lightning storm. He put me out there, you know. That's why you have your oldest son. You can sacrifice him to the lightning storm. But anyhow, I got telling that story, and it led to one thing to another to another. She's like, man, that's funny. You need to do a shop story about all those physics lessons you learned as a young kid. So this is what it is. I'm going to try to connect the dots, but we all know that hunting has tons of physics, and I don't care if we're talking ballistics on bullets, if it's the arc of your arrow, or the stored energy in your bow limbs. When we're talking hunting, we're talking physics. Shooting uphill, shooting downhill, how gravity works on your bullet. The odds are, if you're proficient with all these tools that we use in hunting, you've been schooled in the basics of physics. And you may not know this. Growing up as kids, we applied these on a daily basis. So whether you know Isaac Newton or you know his 3 basic laws, the odds are you've known them all your life. And if you're like me, you didn't even know who Isaac Newton was, but after you heard he came up with all these basic principles of physics, which really are basic principles of hunting, Isaac Newton had to be a hunter. I mean, it's just that simple. All for 2 bales of hay, huh, Mark? He's got a trailer that holds 30 bales, and he has to drive around and put 2 bales on it. All right. So I think all of you who grew up when I did, if you lived like I did in a little logging town, you knew physics. And I learned these principles long before I ever sat in a physics class. And I learned them through some really hard-knock life experiences. Had I known that by the time I was 10 years old, I would be an expert in applied mechanical physics, I could have skipped all of that during my college days when I thought I wanted to be an engineer. Well, later on, I found out that accountants get all their work done in the springtime, and we get to hunt a lot more. So I said, screw this engineering stuff. I'm going to be an accountant. No charge for that advice. When we get into this, there's kind of like 3 parts to this story. And I'm going to discuss Newton's 3 laws of motion. And I'm going to try to tell you how I became familiar with each of these 3 laws of motion, which I could have given them, rather than Newton's laws, it could have been Newberg's law. It could have been Macranacet's law, it could have been Cotton Lundstrom's law, Pee Wee Bloom, you name it, Merle Mack. They all taught me some rule of physics. In this first law that Newton came up with, he said, an object will not change its motion unless a force acts on it. Well, no kidding. That's pretty obvious. If I'm standing still, I'm going to still be standing still until Boyer Levesey runs me over with his bicycle. In his second law, the force of an object is equal to its mass times its acceleration, or in some cases, deceleration. And then in Newton's third law, when 2 objects interact, they apply forces to each other of equal magnitude and the opposite direction. All 3 of these laws, Newton's laws, became very apparent to me. I think I was 5. And there's one single event, I could probably tie them all together. And I'll try my best to tell this story the way I recall it. We're talking like almost 50 years ago now. We're going to put a picture up on the screen, and you're going to see a scab. This is my first school picture. I got a scab about this big right over on my noggin here. But That's 2 weeks later. If you would have seen it 3 days after it happened, that scab extended all the way across my forehead, and I had a bruise from kind of like this side of my, right down my nose, black eye, yellow, purplish, even my ear was bruised. And my mom wasn't going to let me go to school pictures that year if this didn't patch up or heal up a little bit. So the morning of school pictures in kindergarten, she looked at me and she's like, I guess I'll let you do it. So, but anyhow, here's how the story goes. I'm sure all of you probably had some childhood event that every kid in the neighborhood talks about. Well, this is one of them. And you're going to hear a lot of Newtonian physics here. It involves me and this guy named Boyer Levesey. He was the biggest kid in 3rd grade. And actually, when I think about it, he was the biggest kid through 6th grade. We had kindergarten through 6th grade in the school I went to. He was the biggest kid in all the grades, and he was only in 3rd grade. Boyer is about 5'6" and 150 pounds at this time. I mean, they had to bring a teacher's desk for him to sit in the 3rd grade. This is where law number 2 comes into play. So I'm at like 50, 55 pound 5-year-old, and we all know that pounds is a measurement relative to mass. Well, Boyer is 3 times my mass, even though he's only 3 years older than me. Down where we lived, all of us kids would get together because the sparrows and stuff would land on the telephone wires, and this is before they buried all the utility lines. And we would be there with our slingshots trying to hit them. I think it was me, my Uncle Jimmer, my Uncle Boog, my cousin Robin, probably Dick Ferguson, probably, who knows, Wally Pritchard. All of us kids would get together and do this. We had jackknives. We would go cut a willow twig with a fork in it. And no one ever threw away the inner tube of a bike tire or a truck tire or anything, because we'd go cut these long rubber strips. And that's what stored all the energy for our slingshot. If you didn't have a jackknife and weren't handy in the bushcraft of making slingshots, you probably, you were just one of those kids we called city slickers. You came up for camp that week or something. But anyhow, when you're making your slingshot, right, you cut this V-notch, you strip all the bark off, you take some inner tube strips. Pretty soon you've got a slingshot that's really effective. And you learn a lot about stored energy, kind of like what's in our compound bows, right? In those cams, stored energy, kind of the same thing. You become an expert in projectile selection. I mean, something that I had no idea that using a slingshot was going to help me in my bullet selection later on in my life. And here's how it works. So my dad grew up in the Iron Range country over by Hibbing, Virginia, Eveleth, all that. And this is the core of the U.S. iron mining industry. Where he was from, you either worked in the mine, you worked in a taconite plant, or you worked on the railroad that hauled the taconite to Duluth, where they put it on these big ships like the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they hauled it to Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Erie and places like that. Some of you may not have even heard of taconite, but it's a little round pellet of processed iron ore. And they refine it, and by making it these little round pellets, it's really easy to haul and transport, and it gets rid of a lot of the waste. So we're like really, really high power iron ore here in a taconite pellet. So over on Deranged, which is what they call it in northern Minnesota, if you don't call it Deranged, they know you're not from Deranged, okay? Along the railroad tracks by my grandma and grandpa's house, there was taconite everywhere. And I'd just load it by the buckets, and I'd bring it back home to Big Falls. And the sectional density of taconite was so much better than these random rocks that you would find in the gravel, that around Big Falls, we didn't have any of that. So all the Big Falls kids were shooting, weird shaped rocks, and I show up with these perfect, round, high density pieces of taconite, where the ballistic coefficient, the aerodynamics of this perfectly round ball was absolutely excellent. And these little balls would overcome the drag. So we're talking physics, right? We're talking the drag of air. Go look up ballistic coefficient for your bullet. It's important. I learned this at age 6 or 7 about sectional density and ballistic coefficient because I had the best projectiles for my slingshot of any kid in town. Being the connoisseur of fine projectiles and having access to them when I went to my grandparents, I kind of was running a little contraband business of selling taconite pellets out behind my parents' house. If you wonder why I look for bullets with the highest sectional density and the best ballistic coefficient, it all comes back to my tender age back in 1970, shooting taconite from my homemade slingshot in Big Falls, Minnesota, and getting run over by Boyer Levesey. Anyhow, back to this physics lesson with Boyer. We're standing there, and here comes Boyer, and he is packing the freight, man. He's yelling something, and I'm focused on these birds up on the wire. And by the time I hear Boyer hollering to get the hell out of the way, it's too late for any evasive action. I'm like, oops, this is not going to be good. Force equals mass times acceleration, or mass times deceleration when something comes to a stop. And then I don't remember anything other than I'm slowly regaining consciousness. Next thing I know, there's chaos and mayhem. We're talking blood and teeth and skin. And I mean, in our town, if you hadn't been knocked out 8 or 10 times by the time you're 12, you really had a sheltered life, okay? So I'm sitting there in the dirt and gravel and sand, and I'm kind of coming to and, you know, spitting out teeth chips and blood and dirt. And the other kids are trying to extract me from this debris pile. And the first thing I really remember waking up is I look over and Boyer, this great big kid, is sitting across this little dirt road with he's kind of like this, just sobbing, like he thought he'd killed me. And yeah, I would say this probably was my closest brush with death in my short life to this time of whatever I was, 5 or 6 years. But if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you remember these old bike tires, right? They were solid rubber. There was no air in a bike tire, okay? It was solid rubber connected to a metal wheel, kind of like a Conestoga wagon wheel, but it was rubber. Well, you take 150 pounds of humanity traveling at 15 miles an hour, that's gonna result in an awful lot of hide coming off the forehead of a 5-year-old. So some of you might think this was a crash, but really it was a crash course in physics. Like inelastic collisions, momentum, kinetic energy, all that kind of stuff. That was a real life lesson because by now, you know, the skin's growing back. So what you're seeing here isn't the real bad part of it. It looked like someone had put my face on a belt sander. I had no hide left on my nose. That had grown back. My eyebrows were starting to grow back. My mom almost wouldn't take me out anywhere because they thought that she's probably beaten me or something. But you know, that's just the childhood of growing up in a little logging town. No one worried about that kind of stuff. It's like, he probably fell off the roof or something. You know, he'll be better next week. I could not believe how well I improved over the time of that. But we're poor, man. The hospital is 20 miles away. My parents aren't going to spend, the gas to take me to Little Fork to the hospital, or the cost of seeing a doctor. My mom had a whole medicine chest full of mercurochrome and St. John's baby's aspirins. That was the extent of her toolkit. And for you people under 40, go Google mercurochrome. That was the cure for everything and anything back in our day. And when you go Google it, you'll see that it's now a banned substance, and you probably wonder, well, how did you people survive when your parents are administering first aid with a mercury bromide substance? Evidently they didn't have DDT or Roundup or something to put on us, so they used mercurochrome. So after my mom smears mercurochrome all over my face, and mercurochrome burns when you put it in an open wound, the wound stops, or the pain of the injury stops because the mercurochrome hurts so bad. They wrapped me up with pillowcases and gauze and stuff. I looked like a little drummer boy in the Civil War or something, you know, walking around with a big bandage on my head. And, but hey, it didn't kill me. So the funny part of this is Boyer, even though he's this great big kid, he's kind of a contradiction. He was so soft-hearted and he felt terrible. And for me, getting even was not an option with Boyer. Because he was the biggest, toughest, most soft-hearted kid, if you want to call a person that size a kid, in the entire county. And after that, he felt so bad, he was my protector out there on the schoolyard at school. Not even the bullies messed with Boyer's flock. So if you were under Boyer's protection, the grade school kind of bullying took care of itself. And my mom, she would always caution me, right, when we were little kids. They're like, well, when you cross the road, look both ways. Hell with that, Mom. When I cross the road, I'm looking for Boyer Levacy. So thanks to Boyer, by the ripe age of maybe 5, I'd had some serious progress towards an education in applied mechanical physics. And I had no idea who Isaac Newton was, but I sure as hell knew who Boyer Levacy was. And he taught me more about physics than any of those college classes I sat through. So now, this lesson number 2 kind of gets to the thing of my wife asking about the guy a couple months ago out there fiddling in his yard in a thunderstorm, and me telling her that my dad used to send me out there. Because, you know, I'm his oldest, I'm the boy, I got to learn this stuff was kind of his mindset. And God bless my dad. I mean, he's been dead now, let's see, 2004, so 17 years. He died at 62. He had his battles in life, but he was kind of a funny guy. So this physics lesson involves torque, fulcrums, like the leverage from fulcrums and stuff, and the importance of my dad being able to watch the Ed Sullivan Show. When I was 7, we're now like 2 years into this nuclear family of owning a TV. Yeah, we didn't own a TV when I was born, okay? So, and when we did finally get a TV, it was one of these little 12-inch, you know, that iPad screen you guys have was about how big the TV was. And then we upgraded to a Zenith, like, woo, man, oh, holy cow. And that was a Zenith that my dad bought from my future stepdad, but we don't need to get into those details at this time. Anyhow, if you ever drive out in the country, and yeah, we were like out in the country, we probably made country folk feel urbanized in Big Falls, Minnesota. But if you see an old homestead out there, and you might see a tall antenna looking device coming out of the seal, it looks like it's coming out of the house. Well, what you don't see is the 7-year-old who was in charge as being the remote control, the guy who adjusted the antenna so that you could get TV reception with passing clouds and storms and other things that created interference for reasons we could never understand. And what you don't likely see, in addition to that, is the pipe wrench and the cheater bar needed for a 7-year-old to change the channel by applying torque to this antenna. So when I hear folks talk about how their television remote is not working, I laugh. Because from age 7 to about 10, I was the TV remote control at our house. It just came with being the oldest sibling. I mean, my younger sister couldn't do it. And my younger brother, he was so young, he couldn't do it. So they were denied these physics lessons. As advancement in technology kind of deprived these younger generations, I almost feel sorry that they didn't get to be part of these laboratory sessions that are applied basic physics that our parents taught us or that we taught ourselves. Anyhow, here's some background to how the TV situation at our house kind of plays into this story. For many years, we only got CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, out of Canada, Winnipeg. And it was pumping out the juice across the border and polluting the northern Minnesota airwaves with things like 24 Hours, their news channel, the Beachcombers, the Irish Rovers, I'm trying to think, all the Canadian shows. That's what we got. Well, my dad, he's uptown at the pub, which in Big Falls is known as the Muni, the liquor store, the Powerhouse. There's only one bar in town, and it's owned by the city. That's why taxes are low in Big Falls. The city owns the most profitable business there. So my dad's up at the Powerhouse, and he hears that if you build this really tall antenna, you might be able to jack some of the channels coming out of Duluth. So WDIO, WIRT, which is channels 10 and 13, I came to learn, had built a repeater station over east of us in Hibbing, about 15 miles from where my dad grew up on Deranged. From that tower, they were broadcasting serious stuff. I mean, Gilligan's Island, All in the Family, the Jeffersons, AWA All-Star Wrestling, and most importantly, to my dad, the Ed Sullivan Show, mixed in with a little Lawrence Welk and a little bit of the Shimoleski Funtime Band, which was a really local, it was a super popular local polka band. So he's dead set that we need a taller antennae, as he called it. He's gonna jack WDIO, WIRT out of Hibbing, and we're done just watching Hockey Night in Canada out of Winnipeg. Our house had the misfortune of being slightly down this grade here. The slope just rolled down a little bit, so we needed like 25 extra feet of antenna to get high enough to do what the guys up at the pub were doing. So my dad, he's thinking, I'm a pretty big auger, man. I'm not gonna be outdone by Buster Manders or John Bekenta or any of these other guys. So he decided, I gotta go to the auction sales and find the stuff to do this. And auction sales in Minnesota were known for selling assortments of pipe and steel and nuts and bolts and other worthless junk that my dad viewed as treasure. So one morning, Dad and Mac Ranasset, they're digging a hole. Mac lives across the street. They're digging a hole for this concrete footing. I don't know what they're doing, but it's gonna hold this antenna. So the hole's like 3 feet deep and about, 2 feet in diameter. And I'm a kid, I'm watching. They got a wheelbarrow. They're mixing some gray powder and some gravel and some water. And they pour it in there. And little did I know later on, it become concrete, a chemical reaction, not just physics. We're talking like, I'm learning all kinds of stuff here. So they dump like the second wheelbarrow of mud, and they get this 3-inch pipe that they place down in there that my dad got from Ryala's auction. And my dad was a Finn, so he preferred going to auction sales held by other Finns. So he would look to see what the name was: Ryala, Penttinen, Pellinen, Rissanen, Mackie. Any of these good Finlander names, that's where my dad would go. Or if you had a first name like Toivo or Oivo or Eero or Mikko, my dad trusted that those Finns, they were purveyors of the highest quality junk in northern Minnesota. Hang with me here. We're going to get to the physics lessons, but I just need to give you a little bit more background for the proper context. So with this 3-inch casing, it's set in this concrete, and they let it set up, and a couple days later, everything's firm and ready to go. Now Dad went to work to building this mounting piece that slides down in this casing. And it started with like a 12-foot section of maybe 2.5-inch pipe, and piece after piece welded together by my grandpa Bob. My mom's dad owned a machine shop. He is the welder in town before moving up to Alaska to work on the pipeline in like 1975. So thanks to his father-in-law, my dad now had an antenna that almost needed a light on it. It was so tall. The entire contraption gets erected. And through a lot of cussing, a lot of beer breaks in between, this antenna is way up in the air, and my dad, being the tightwad that he is, he's trying to wire it. So you put a wire up there, and now you gotta thread it all the way down. And you thread it down this pipe, and at the bottom, he's got this little Mickey Mouse eyelet that the pipe or the cable goes through that, comes out there around 3 birch trees and a pile of rocks. And in a hole, there's a reason loggers aren't contractors. My dad punched a hole in the living room wall about that big for a cable that was only about that big. And we could get into some marital advice here. But suffice to say, my parents' marriage only lasted another 4 years past this. But my dad, being the tightwad, first he had a bunch of like 10 or 20 foot cables, and it wasn't working. So it pissed him off. Now he's got to drive all the way to Bemidji, 72 miles, to find a cable long enough. And I still remember we went to, I think it's Gold Finds or some Gibson's or something, and he found a 75 footer. Understand, my dad was a logger, not a contractor, not an electrician, so he's doing his best here. So just don't be judgmental. But here's where we're going to get into the physics lessons. So torque is pretty much the rotational equivalent of linear force. The kind of force that Boyer Levesey applied to me when he ran me over with his bicycle. Well, Archimedes taught us about levers and distance from the point of leverage. Kind of like when we're kids and we're on the playground in the teeter-totter and the big kid jumps on the end and the little kid gets vaulted into orbit and comes down half on the snowbank and half on the teeter-totter. That's Archimedes' principle right there. So, the distance from which the force is placed on an object, the greater the resulting force that person can impose. My lesson in physics kind of goes like this. Dad wants to watch the Ed Sullivan show at 7 o'clock on Sunday evening because word is out, Ed Sullivan show's going off the air. And he decides he's got to have the channel change from Winnipeg, which was to our northwest, because he'd watched Hockey Night in Canada the night before, and pivoted about 125 degrees over to the east-southeast vector, where he can jack that feed coming out of Hibbing, and he can get WIRT channel 10 and 13. He sends me outside. And as I'm walking out the door, he reminds me of which way you got to put the pipe wrench on the antenna and where the cheater bar is. And he taught me all this. I mean, this was training in his mind. This was like life experiences. Because in his mind, he's like, if I'm going to sit here and drink a cold Pabst Blue Ribbon, I got to have a remote control. So I got this is a prop here. Some country music singer had a song about the double wide trailer. We lived in single wide trailers. We weren't double wide. We weren't that high speed yet. But the guy said he's the Charlie Daniels of the torque wrench. Well, by age 7, I was the Charlie Daniels of the pipe wrench, man. There's very little. I bet you I could fix my bow with this pipe wrench. I wanted to get to age 50 without a lawnmower, and I succeeded. But I would never be caught without a pipe wrench. I have pipe wrenches stored just about any place, anywhere. This is like a tool my dad taught me from age 6. The amount of leverage that a pipe wrench gives you. So I walk out the door, and Dad's giving me the instructions. Do this, do that. Yeah, Dad, I know that you got to have it flipped a certain way. And if I'm coming back to the west, I got to go this way. If I'm going east, I go that way. And then out there, he kept about a 4-foot cheater bar that was big enough to go over the handle of this. So in the wintertime, sometimes that antenna would freeze into that mounting pipe he had there. And even a 7-year-old at that time, if he really put the torque to it out here on the cheater bar, you could break that ice free. So it would kind of go like this. I'd start pushing, and if this is the pipe it sits in, and there's an antenna here, he had a yellow notch on the antenna because every logger had chalk because they had to mark the stumps of, okay, this is going to Huffnagels, this is going to Boise, blah, blah, blah. They had blue, red, and yellow chalk. It's like a waxy chalk. So my dad, the pipe comes down. My dad puts the yellow notch that kind of lines up, or yellow mark that lines up with what direction he wants the antenna. And then over here, he's got blue. This is Winnipeg. And over here, he's got red. This is Hibbing. So to get the channel that he wanted, I go out there and I put my pipe wrench on this antenna, and I'm pushing and I'm doing this, and he's starting like, whoa, yeah. I got to really put my shoulder to this thing with this big pipe wrench, and it's pivoting and it's starting to swing, and it's like, ooh, and it always would go a little bit too far. And he'd swear the world came to an end. Hold on, back it up. All right, so I'd have to take the pipe wrench, flip it a 180, come over to the other side of the antenna, And I'd slowly go, and he'd be like, whoop, oh, hop, right there, oh, there you got it. Oh, gosh. And he'd crack another beer and light up another Salem cigarette. Some of you might think this was just unjust for him to treat me as his channel changer. He viewed it as, this kid is learning stuff, man. He's gonna know more about physics by the time he's 10. So that's kind of how it worked. My dad got to watch, I still remember him watching the final episode of Ed Sullivan. And it's all because I understood Archimedes' principle of the further away from the point of leverage, the greater the force applied. We ended up getting to watch. I'll tell you that it did come in. The guys down at the Powerhouse there, the liquor store, they were right. If you marched it enough over to the east, southeast, you could get Hibbing if you had a tall enough antenna. And if you had to, you could swing it back over to Winnipeg. Everything was fine. And I'm telling my wife this when we see this guy out there. And she's like, really? Your dad did that? I'm like, not just my dad. Every dad in the neighborhood. That was the purpose of having a 7-year-old and a pipe wrench, was to be the remote control for your TV. And every once in a while, you know, you get some weather, some cloud cover, or some mysterious form of interference. Nobody knew what it would be. And he'd be almost falling asleep after beer number 4. Hey, get out there, we're losing the channel. So you'd have to go out there, and we're talking like just little fractions. So precision became part of something that you understood as a child. Like, you know, good isn't good enough. The other thing some of you probably don't realize in today's world, because you stream stuff on your TV or you possibly have a cable TV package. Well, back in the day, there was this thing called UHF and VHF. And VHF stood for very high frequency. I think it was channels 2 through 13. And when you got really serious in, you know, you wanted the 1972 equivalent of 4K, you got a TV that had UHF, ultra high frequency. And to me, that was just another lesson in physics. I mean, I'm like, by this time now, I'm like a quasi-electrical engineer, and I'm not even in junior high. I know the difference between UHF and VHF. I bet you there's 40-year-olds right now that don't know the difference between UHF and VHF because you didn't have an old man who sent you out there in the tornado or the lightning storm to be his kind of fine-tuning device so that there was no static when he was trying to listen to Archie Bunker or the Beverly Hillbillies or something like that. All I had to do was to push and get far away from the point of leverage, and all these angular forces would carry this antenna just a few degrees clockwise, and voila. My dad was happy. If he was happy, my mom was happy, everybody was happy. But him now being able to get the channel in Hibbing would result in some future physics lessons that I really wasn't that happy about. And that's kind of lesson number 3 in this. So I'll back up even a little bit here for lesson number 2. My dad had a 1969 GMC 2-wheel drive pickup truck. He thought 4-wheel drives were for idiots. I mean, hardly anyone had one. He thought they were for idiots who wanted to get stuck further in the muck. And this is every time we went hunting. So he had a distributor and a cap, right? And the old carbureted engines had a rotor and cap. He'd run through the muck hole. There'd always be a crack in his distributor cap, and she'd die right out in the middle. Well, who has to get out? Me. You know, if someone's getting wet, it's going to be the kid. So I became a really good expert with come-alongs, and this is where this leverage thing about Archimedes, that if we were going to get to the deer stand before, you know, hunting light ended, I had to go find a big stout tree, or at least a pretty long limb, that he and I could get on the end of it, and we could lift a little bit. And if we lifted it enough along, oh, here's another tool. You know, if you don't have one of these, you're nobody in Big Falls, Minnesota. I mean, you wouldn't dare show up in Big Falls, Minnesota without having, you guys call them high lift jacks? They're not a high lift jack. It's a Handyman Jack. And you're not too old before you learn if you put a logging chain here and you attach it to a tree over there, and you take a logging chain here and attach it to the bumper of Dad's blue and white 69 GMC, and you get the 8-year-old standing in the muck hole jacking on this thing, pretty soon you don't need a beautiful worn winch. You got a 10-year-old who knows how to run a Handyman Jack. That's your worn winch. If I wanted to get out to the duck blind in time to shoot something, I better know how to jack Dad's truck out of the muck hole. And thanks to Handyman Jack, I learned how to do that by 10 for sure. So let's get on to lesson 3, and it has to do with my old man thinking he's gonna be the big muckety muck in the neighborhood. My dad gets the Hibbing channel, or Duluth channel, relayed from Hibbing, and now he's seeing all these ads. And there's one, I can't remember who's pitching it, but you can get this set of 3 industrial soup ladles. So this lesson, you might think it's about wooden spoons or soup spoons. It's really a whole bunch of physics that later in my life really became important to how I set up my arrows and how I select my bullets. A lot of archers get all worked up about speed, and I'm going to call them the wooden spoon crowd. I was more of a member, and still am a member, of what I'd call the soup spoon crowd. That's a crowd that believes in a much heavier and higher quality spoon that leaves not only just a little short-term welt, but a serious bruise to remind somebody of the physical consequences and that you should be paying attention to things. My dad wanted to impress all the ladies in the neighborhood, so he went and bought them all. The advertisement says, buy one now and get, 14 sets or 3 sets for nothing more than shipping. Well, my dad, he's like, you can't beat a deal like that. Oh my gosh, you just gotta go with that. So by the time he's done buying soup spoons, these are like industrial strength soup spoons, okay? These aren't like wooden spoons. We're talking stuff that the military would have commissioned this set of soup spoons. The first set he bought for my mom, and it came with 2 extras. So he gave one of the sets to Beverly Ranacid across the road, and then Ethel Gowdy across the road. And then he bought some more, and Gracie, she had some, and Ruby and Gail, and pretty soon the whole neighborhood is armed with these big industrial strength soup ladles. He was handing out soup spoons to the moms of the neighborhood like a proud father would hand out cigars upon the firstborn childbirth, We were held to a pretty high expectation of behavior. And we knew that any kid's house you went to, it was fair game to get a beating, okay? You would never go dare tell your parents that, Gracie Gustafson just put a boot in your ass, because your parents would be mad. They would say, well, you must have been out of line, and then they'd beat you. So you'd get 2 beatings for the price of 1. Big Falls, Minnesota was a community that didn't believe it takes a village to raise a child. In 1972, the motto was more of, it takes a village to beat a child. Like my Grandma Harriet, she was really good at beating. And I'd be like, Grandma, I didn't do it. I wasn't there. Well, that makes up for the times you didn't get caught. Give you another crack with the spoon. The behavior of the kids got a lot better after my dad started arming all the mothers in the neighborhood with these industrial strength soup ladles. And this is how it applies somewhat to hunting. So you know how they say that bull elk grow big antlers so that they can display? And by displaying, not only are they showing off to the cow elk that they're, the guy they should be hanging out with, but it's to scare off all of the other bull elk. And if he's got big enough antlers and he can posture well enough, he almost avoids a confrontation, and it saves energy, lowers risk. Well, after my dad got done doing all this, when you'd walk into someone's house You know, if it was one of the mothers of the community that my dad had bought the soup ladles for, they'd display them kind of like my dad displayed his firearms on a rack. As quick as you walk in, here's hanging on the wall right there's all these great big soup ladles. And that was fair warning to any kid that those hurt and I'm well trained in how to use them, so behave yourself. Now, if they would have just hung little wooden spoons up there, we knew that these didn't hurt. We would fake cry, you know, mom would cry, "Ah!" just so you could get back outside and get in another slingshot fight with your friends or something, you know? If you didn't act like it hurt with a wooden spoon, then you'd probably get a boot or a kick or something. You take something like this, and this is really thin. I mean, the women back in Big Falls wouldn't be caught dead with a spoon of that flimsy quality. This one's pretty stout. I mean, this stuff bruises, but they came on handles like that much longer and they weighed an extra 2 pounds. So with so many kids in this target-rich environment, for the mothers, you know, they're intent on trying to raise well-behaved children and they'll do whatever it takes. You combine this with their nicotine drought edginess brought on by the fact that they're running out of cigarettes, an industrial soup spoon was a brutal combination. So here's the physics of all this. We're going to go back to force equals mass times acceleration. Or in the case of getting a beating, you know, force equals mass times deceleration. When a soup spoon hits your butt, the force of one item, the spoon, is applied to the other item, your rear end, in equal magnitude and in the opposite direction, as Newton would tell us. In this case, the deceleration of my body mass stopping the swiftly moving soup spoon creates this force. So let's investigate the force component of this beating, specifically the mass part of the equation. So good metal soup spoons weigh about 5 times what a wooden spoon weighs. So the mass part of the force applied is about 5x. Just a function of the density of the materials. The welt from this little spoon on a flat profile with low sectional density can't inflict nearly the amount of force as a heavier metal soup spoon. Additionally, this flat profile right here of the wooden spoon, it spreads out all of this force over a much larger surface area on your butt cheek. Compare that to this rounded piece here where all of this, right here, this metal, all this force gets applied to a very small surface area. So you're probably asking, what do spoons have to do with my archery setup? Well, it's all a function of momentum. Momentum is defined by the physicists as mass times velocity, or P equals m times v. And this is often confused with kinetic energy or vice versa. Momentum is where it's at least in my opinion. I know everyone's going to have a different opinion, but kinetic energy is a function of velocity. And in kinetic energy, velocity is squared. When you're interchanging these two concepts, know that they are different. Now, force is a function of mass, and I should say mass and acceleration. So force equals mass times acceleration or mass times deceleration. And in other words, the force that is applied against the rump of a 10-year-old or on the thigh of an 8-year-old who just threw a baseball through the living room window. Speaking from experience here. Enough of those beatings, and you quickly realize that the best archery setup is an arrow of 500 plus grains with a super sharp cut on contact point. Little did I know that my mom's decorative arsenal of soup ladles would be so formative as I started figuring out what type of archery elk equipment I was going to use. So there you have it, folks. If you grew up in the 1960s or the 1970s, the odds are college physics was pretty easy for you. And there's probably even better odds that your equipment selection today when you're out hunting, whether archery or rifle hunting, is heavily influenced by some of these real life physics lessons that you learned before you were even 12 years old. Now they had to invent this thing called Google just so kids could try and learn this crap. These are life lessons that have stuck with us through our adult life and made us much better hunters. Had my dad not desired to watch wrestling from the Duluth Hibbing feed, my mom would have never learned of these industrial strength soup ladle sets, and I would have never learned the value of a heavy arrow setup 30 years later when I finally got into archery. I mean, archery became a big distraction in my adult life, and I'm thankful for all these physics lessons, as painful as they were. So to Boyer, to my mom's selection of soup ladles, to the Tacknite plant, to WDIO, WIRT, Channel 10 and 13 out of Duluth and Hibbing, I owe you much of my hunting skills that I've acquired through this life. Thanks for watching.